Hey y'all, I'm Ash Vampire, and you're watching Shoring Up. Okay, so the next couple of Shoring Ups are going to be over a series of shows that I've mentioned in both edited content and the Shoring Up videos that you're looking at right now, or at least one of the episodes. And that is going to be the triumvirate of key animation shows Air, Canon, and Clannad. I'm going to be talking about them in order. That being today, we're going to be talking about Air. And we're going to do this because I watched them back to back. And it's an interesting way to look at all of them, to watch them all one after the other. Simply because it gives you a little bit of... I felt like when I was watching it that it gave me a little bit of insight into exactly how I don't want to say the industry, but you can see the evolution of how these kinds of shows were interpreted and how they were made in terms of the ethos of the people making them changed over time. So that's going to be probably the next 3 or 4 shoring ups, is Air, Canon, Clannad, and then Clannad After Story at the end. So let's get right to it. Let's get into Air itself. The very first, the beginning. Air is, in a word, esoteric. Now, when I say that Air is esoteric, I don't want to say, I don't want to come across as saying that Air is visually esoteric, or it is esoteric in that it is difficult to follow. That is not true. Air is pretty straightforward in its narrative. Nothing it does visually is particularly, eye-opening or weird or strange, or, there's a lot going on in terms of the visuals. They don't use the visuals in any sort of unique way to present unique ideas. Air is just esoteric in its tone. It has this sort of aloofness about it in terms of how it handles its characters, how it handles its narrative, that makes it just kind of dreamy in a way, which is kind of interesting because of how pervasive the idea of the dream pervades all 3 of Air, Canon, and Clannad. And you can kind of get this sense of this is probably where it started, and it's a lot stronger here. It's interesting to look at Clannad in a way that... Did I just say Clannad? I did. I just said Clannad. No. It's interesting to look at Air in a way that you can tell almost that they didn't 100% know exactly how to handle the more fantastical elements that were going to end up being present in all 3. It, like I said, it just comes off as very esoteric, as very whimsical, and almost, and like I said, aloof. It's not that nothing matters. It's not that there's no character motivation, or it's not that there's no narrative drive to the story. It just kind of feels as though you really are an audience member. And a lot of good shows kind of make you forget that you're an audience member, right? They really suspend your disbelief and allow you to become fully absorbed in the events going on in whatever show it is you're watching. Air never does that, and I think that is where it really I think that in and of itself is where that esoteric feeling really comes from, is the fact that you never actually feel connected to any of these characters. You really do feel like you are very much an outsider looking in and watching the lives of these characters and the very strange things that happen to all of them. It's a very interesting experience to have, and I would actually recommend Air just on that basis. If you're into that kind of very odd sensations that you would get from watching a show like this. And Air's esotericism kind of pervades it. It is everywhere. So Air, like all of the sisters that it would end up having, is based on a visual novel. This is pretty obvious from the large cast of female characters and in the way that the main guy interacts with them until like their individual problem is resolved, and then you never really see them again, and they're not really plot relevant after that. But outside of those very basic tenets of exactly how a visual novel functions and how a visual novel adaptation functions, Air doesn't really feel like it doesn't feel like a visual novel really at all. And I think a lot of that has to do with its pacing in terms of not the individual arcs. The individual arcs very much feel pretty standard in terms of, you know, problem is presented, guy struggles to figure out exactly how to solve it, and either he solves it within that episode or he solves it within the next episode. So it is standard in that way, but the way it goes about getting to the larger point is very, you don't get a real hard line sense of it being a visual novel. And I think that a lot of that comes from exactly the very specific dynamic between the main guy and all of the girls. And the number one distinction between Air and a lot of shows like this is the age difference between the main guy and all of the girls that he meets. Typically in a visual novel, visual novel adaptation rather, the main guy is of a similar age to the main girls, and this follows on from the fact that most visual novels are dating sims in some variety, and you get a romance option, and an adaptation follows through with that by selecting one of those romance options and running with that. Because of the massive age gap, I don't want to say massive, but the distinctive age gap between the main guy and all the girls that he meets, there is never an impression that is even remotely a possibility. So it completely changes how he interacts with all of the girls that he meets, and you're kind of put in a position of wondering, okay, well then what's the point? Because in a lot of VN adaptations, the end romance is the point. And for it to then completely remove that really changes how you view the show and how you and how you interact with the show in terms of, you know, the guesses that you make along the way and trying to figure out where it's going, what's the plot direction. You know, you don't get a real sense of exactly why this thing exists or what exactly it's trying to go for in terms of message. So that alone, I think just because of that, you could be forgiven if you just didn't realize that Air was a visual novel adaptation. And on top of that, though not, you know, as nearly as important, the main guy just disappears at the end of the show. He just fucking leaves. He just is gone. And you're sitting there and you're that sense that you had of, okay, this is kind of weird in terms of just how to approach a visual novel, is blown out of the water. It's like confirmation bias almost, of like you're like, okay, well really what is the point? You know, why does this exist? Air almost encourages you to think about it more. And I know in my last showing up on Redline, I made a point about how it is enjoyable to analyze a show more deeply, to think about something in a more analytical and intellectual sense. Air almost feels like it wants you to do that. It wants you to have a more in-depth thought process in terms of exactly what you're getting out of the show and what you're interpreting from the show. And it really hammers that idea home, I think, in the fact that the main guy just disappears entirely from the main plot line at the very end. So when you couple that with the fact that he's not really being portrayed as a romantic interest for any of these girls, it really just causes me, at least, to start to wonder exactly what it is that this show is going for. And to be completely honest, I never figured it out. I 100% never figured out exactly why Air exists from a analytical, intellectual, or, you know, even emotional standpoint. I really didn't understand what it was going for, outside of its very obvious ideas of, like, being able to move on from loss, or to being able to let go of things that you have no need to hold on to. That's about as close as it gets, but it pretty much really, like, it just outright states that idea. effectively at the very end. So I don't understand Air at all. I can like the best I've got is that it's trying to get you to think about it. It's trying to get you to interpret something that's more deep about it. But the esotericism is just so far out there and is just so uninterested in trying to explain itself to the audience that I don't get it. I, honest to God, don't get it. And that's not necessarily a mark against Air, but it definitely made me like question exactly why I spent the time watching it. It's not as though it was not enjoyable in the moment. It definitely, the esotericism I think is solid enough, and the experience in and of itself is solid enough to enjoy watching it. But for a show that really appears to want you to get something more out of it, and then it's just so strange and difficult to interpret that you can't, or, I mean, maybe I just haven't put enough thought into it, but it's very odd. It's very, very odd, and it's confusing, and you would think that I would have like a weird sense of like incompleteness with not having gotten what I suppose is intended to be there. But even then, the esotericism is strong enough to even really not make that an issue, really. It's just odd. It's very, very strange. And I mean, if somebody's got the answer, I would love to hear it. Air is weird, dude. Air is weird. Now, Air does do a lot of interesting things from a technical and storytelling perspective that I think are notable in their unique handling of, of plot contrivance or MacGuffins. The magic as presented in Air is significantly less flashy and overt than what you would typically be expecting from a show that has those elements in it. It's a lot more akin to like mysticism and has ties very close to religion. So even though the magic in the show is used just exactly the same way that it is in every other show, i.e. it's a plot contrivance to make sure that the plot can actually move forward, it doesn't really feel as egregious, even though it is exactly the same. There's no way around it. It uses it the exact same way, but it's the lack of emphasis visually on those elements makes it stand out less and makes it feel more like just a part of this world that you're watching. So it just doesn't feel like it comes out of nowhere, because there's just so little of it to latch onto that you don't get a sense that it is really within the character's power. And I think that a lot of times is why MacGuffins, in terms of like magic or a new weapon or a new ability that a character will gain that then allows him to move the plot forward, I think the reason that those tend to bother a lot of people and how contrived they are is because so much attention is drawn to them visually. But because Air really downplays the visual element and makes it more mystical and less directly within the character's hands and things just happen to them, it doesn't feel nearly as contrived. And this is a constant thing in all three of Air Canon and Clannad. All of them take this approach, and the other two do it better. But again, that's part of the learning curve that the next couple showing ups are going to talk about, in that Air experimented with a lot of things, this being one of them, and then it was refined in the shows that would come after. And so you can see that kind of genesis of how to handle plot contrivance for the sake of narrative. I certainly, obviously, I was able to, see that it was a plot contrivance, but again, it wasn't so blatant and obvious, and it was constructed in such a way that I didn't feel like I'd been cheated out of anything. I didn't feel like my catharsis was lessened or ruined because of the use of those elements. I want to go back real quick to the point I made about how the main guy just up and disappears at the end of the show. Another thing about this that is kind of odd is that his emotional arc within the show, once he disappears, is just left unresolved. You don't get any payoff to his story or, you know, anything that he did. You know, he leaves, he comes into the show searching for something, and he finds it, kind of, but he doesn't really stick around to, like, get resolution on it. You know, it just, his departure is so emotionally unresolved that it just adds to that weirdness factor, that esotericism, that you're wondering, not only, like, by the end of the show, like, what did I just watch? Why did I, you know, what did I get out of this? But if you're looking at it purely from just the character perspective, you're like, why did I care about this guy? You know, he comes in, and he's got an interesting, you know, emotional arc that is very obvious from the very beginning, and you never see a resolution. It's so strange. It's so bizarre. And the show kind of, like, plays up that, you know, in the flashback episode, you know, the 2 flashback episodes, that, you know, this is supposed to be your, you know, emotional resolution for him, and finally figuring out exactly why he's got these, you know, these issues, and why, you know, he's driven to do things and be the way that he is. But he himself not getting any resolution is just odd. It's just really, really strange, especially since he is ostensibly the main character, at least on the male side. Man, I forgot to bring that up back when I was talking about him, but it's weird. Again, I can't say it enough times. Air just doesn't make any sense. It makes very odd catharsis choices, i.e. it doesn't have any. But it never... I think the interesting part about that is that normally that would really piss me off, like a whole lot. I'm big into I'm big into shows setting up for and then delivering their catharsis in a satisfactory way that leaves me satisfied. And even though Air does set up for some and then doesn't actually do it, I'm just not pissed off. It's just there's never a sense that Air was, like, predisposed to doing that. It never... Even though it did set up the main character to have an emotional arc that could have been resolved, you never get the sense while watching Air that it has any intentions of doing that. There's so much unorthodoxy in how Air goes through the motions, because it does go through those visual novel motions, that the just out of place way that it does it, the completely and utterly bizarre way that it handles these elements, causes you to sort of get into a position where, even though you don't get the emotional catharsis that you would be normally expecting, you are like, well, nothing else in this show has been standard, so, I mean, I guess it's not okay. I would have liked to have had some emotional resolution for the main guy, but, like, oh well, you know, that's it. You kind of come away from it thinking, well, that's just the way Air does things. Now, I'm going to talk about the ending here real quick, and I'm not going to spoil it, because I think that if this kind of weirdness in presentation is your shtick, because it is definitely mine, you know, I love Shaft, you know, Trigger is okay. You know, I like weird visuals, I like weird ways of doing storytelling, so if that is your thing, I do encourage you to actually watch it, and I do not want to, you know, spoil the ending. I don't personally believe in spoilers, but in this particular instance, I think that it is worth experiencing it without knowing in advance how it ends. Now, talking about the ending, what I really want to bring up is that, per the show's own logic, per its established rules and exactly how it sets up for the ending, the show really couldn't have ended any other way. Like, there really was no way around what ends up happening in the final episode of the show. But even though you see it coming, even though you have in no way been led to believe that it could happen any other way, it's still shocking. The show still manages to pull off a shock factor, even though it does not offer you any possibility that it won't happen. It's pretty impressive for that. It's really impressive for actually having managed to not in any way give you the secondary option of things ending in a different way, and yet the only way still is very just, it's gut-wrenching. You still feel a lot of emotion when the end actually comes around. So props have to go to Air for still being able to set up that and still being able to execute on that. I don't know how they did it so well, considering how telegraphed the end really was. I think that a lot of that comes from, at least in part, from the fact that they cut away from the main story to go into the flashback, which I'm going to get into here in just a second. So you kind of get a distraction, and so even though in the back of your head you haven't forgotten that this story only ends one way, you get a cutaway as you're caring about a different set of characters, and then you come back and then bam, the ending happens, and you haven't really readjusted. I think that's really probably the primary reason why it still works, is that you haven't fully readjusted to these original characters quite yet when it slams you with the ending. So props to Air for still being able to pull off an ending that it had telegraphed from a mile away. And so my final point, as we close out our discussion of Air, is going to be about those 2 cutaway episodes to the past, where we kind of learn exactly how the conflict, well, not the conflict, but essentially how these characters are in the positions that they are in due to events way, way in the past, and how they are kind of reincarnations of these characters. These are weird, and not in the way that Air is weird. They are strange because they're so long. It's 2 whole episodes of this show that are devoted to this, and they're incredibly detailed, beautifully animated. Like, these are perhaps like the best episodes visually of Air, and it's just kind of odd to me of like just exactly how detailed they are, and how and just from a narrative perspective too. There's a lot of things that are introduced about these characters and the way that they are developed that is just, it feels kind of unnecessary because you only spend 2 episodes with them. But then again, 2 episodes feels almost too long. Like, why did we need 2 episodes of this? It's just very odd that they would devote this much time and energy and development on characters that effectively don't matter. Now, it's not as though what development we do get, especially by the end, it's not as though that doesn't matter, because that has repercussions for exactly how we understand the characters in the present in Air. But it's still just it just feels a little bit over the top for what it is. I'm not going to say I didn't enjoy them. Like, again, they are like the best looking parts of Air and are just very interesting to watch for that alone. But it is kind of weird, and I don't know, like, it feels like a little bit too much went into stuff that really didn't need to have that much put into it, and especially for not nearly as long as we are, with those characters, those full 2 episodes of that. It's just kind of out of the blue and doesn't really make very much sense to me in terms of like why we're there for that. Okay, that is gonna be that's gonna be my discussion for Air. It's very difficult. Air is really hard to come up with, a definitive like this is great or this is not good, because it is just so odd and it's just so tonally aloof, and just it was very difficult for me. This is probably like one of the hardest shows for me to score, just because there are so many elements that I like about it, for sure. But at the same time, I'm also like, yeah, but you could have done this so much better, and you could achieve the same effect. There's a lot that feels like it's missing, especially in the emotional side of things. Air is just a very difficult thing to watch. It's not as though I don't recommend it, but I only recommend it very specifically to people who are into that kind of very odd tonal direction that esotericism that Air takes in terms of its direction. So watch it if you want, but just be prepared when you go into this, that this is not going to be an easy thing to get through. and that you're probably going to be left with more questions than answers. If there is one thing about air that I could say by the end, you will be left with more questions than answers by the end. So I give air a 6. Oh, that was too far. I give air a 6, and I will catch you on the flip side.